Welcome and good afternoon. My name is Alejandro Behr. I'm the director of the Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies and a professor of sociology at the University of Minnesota. And it's a pleasure to be here with you and with our guests this afternoon. Thank you for joining us. Today is January 27th. Today we mark International Holocaust Remembrance Day. And we will take a different perspective on memory in this event. We are interested in exploring the flip side of the Holocaust becoming this ultimate symbol of evil. And we will look and explore the uses, the abuses, and the political appropriations of Holocaust memory. We thank our speaker today, Jelena Subotic, and our University of Minnesota Duluth colleague, Natalie Belsky. Jelena will provide a short lecture, and Natalie will respond, offer comments on this lecture, and then moderate the Q&A, moderate the discussion with all of you. Let me briefly introduce our speaker and also Natalie Belsky. Jelena Subotic is a professor in the Department of Political Science at Georgia State University, and her more recent book, Yellow Star, Red Star, Holocaust Remembrance After Communism, has won many prestigious awards, among other the 2020 American Political Science Association European Politics and Society Book Prize, the 2020 Robert Jervis and Paul Schroeder Prize for the Best Book in International History and Politics, of the American Political Science Association. And her first book was published in 2009, Hijacked Justice, Dealing with the Past in the Balkans, has been translated and also published in Serbia. She is the author of many scholarly articles and chapters, among other topics like memory politics, transitional justice, and politics of the Balkans. Natalie Belsky is assistant professor of history at the University of Minnesota Duluth, and her areas of specialization are Soviet history, Soviet Jewry, the Second World War, and the Holocaust and population displacement. Her current book manuscript examines civilian evacuation in the Soviet Union during the Second World War, with a particular interest in the experiences of Soviet Jewish evacuees, who constitute the largest group of Holocaust survivors in Europe. She has recently published an article in Holocaust and Genocide Studies, which focuses on anti-Semitism on the Soviet home front during the Second World War. With no further ado, I want to turn it over to Jelena, and I want to thank you both again for joining us tonight and for giving us the opportunity to engage with this important subject.
Thank you very much for that wonderful introduction. I'm very happy to be here, especially on International Holocaust Memorial Day. I will share my screen because as part of my presentation, I want to show you some images to further illustrate some of the points that I want to make. Okay. In October 2017, a commemorative plaque in memory of the 200,000 Poles murdered in Warsaw in the German death camp KL Warsaw was unveiled in Warsaw. This was a somber ceremony with a local priest performing Catholic rites and the representative of the Polish army honoring the dead. The only problem, almost none of this was true. There indeed did exist a camp in Warsaw where a few thousand Polish citizens died during the German occupation. But after the burning of the Warsaw Ghetto in 1943, this camp was turned into a concentration and extermination camp for Jews brought in from other parts of Europe, who were used as slave labor to clear the charred remains of the ghetto. A total of some 20,000 people died in this camp, most of them Jews. The Polish citizen movement behind this commemorative project was therefore not just commemorating victims of their own ethnic group at the expense of other victims. This is an unremarkable and largely ubiquitous feature of commemorative politics everywhere. What is, however, remarkable is that the very clear purpose of this commemoration was to put it in direct competition with the memory of the Holocaust, especially in Poland, the geographic heart of the genocide. This new historical remembrance in Poland has been going on for quite some time and has attracted much international attention. In 2018, the Polish government passed a law that criminalized the use of the phrase Polish death camps to designate German Nazi death camps in occupied Poland, such as Auschwitz, Treblinka, and many others, but also criminalized any insinuation that individual Poles may have committed anti-Jewish crimes during the Holocaust. At its most extreme, the new Polish remembrance has inverted even the basic understanding of the Holocaust, as in this cartoon published in a right-wing Polish magazine that depicts the so-called Holocaust, the alleged annihilation of Poles by collaborating Jews and Nazis. But Poland is hardly alone. And as I document in my book, Yellow Star, Red Star, Holocaust Remembrance After Communism, this new historical revisionism has been flourishing across post-communist Europe and is especially visible in historical museums, monuments and memorials, history textbooks, and rehabilitation and restitution laws. I found a remarkably strong but nationally flavored trend of appropriation of Holocaust memory, especially its narrative and visual repertoire, to instead tell the story of communist oppression. For example, in 2014, the Historical Museum of Serbia in Belgrade put up a highly publicized exhibition in the name of the people, political repression in Serbia between 1944 and 1953, which promised to display new historical documents and evidence of communist crimes carried out by communist Yugoslavia in the first post-war years. The most stunning visual artifact displayed, however, was a well-known photograph of emaciated prisoners, one of whom here is Elie Wiesel, in the Nazi Buchenwald concentration camp, the picture taken by a United States Army soldier at Camp Liberation in April 1945. But in the Belgrade exhibition, this canonic image, one of the most famous photographs of the Holocaust, was displayed in the section devoted to the Yugoslav communist era camp for political prisoners on the Adriatic island of Goli Otok. And the caption at the exhibition said, "The example of living conditions of Goli Otok prisoners." The visual image of this display was very clearly that communist oppression looked like the Holocaust. Similarly, in Hungary, the House of Terror Museum that opened in 2002 in Budapest narrates the story of Hungary's 20th century experience as a nation victim of the foreign communist and to a much lesser extent, foreign fascist regime. The House of Terror goes out of its way to bring home the message that fascism and communism were flip sides of the same coin. There are multiple visual representations of Black totalitarianism and red totalitarianism, of the Black arrow cross juxtaposed with a red star, of the fascist uniform juxtaposed with a communist uniform. Obviously, equation of the two totalitarian regimes is not new, nor particularly surprising. What is more interesting is that the blunt message of this state institution is presented through the appropriation of not just Holocaust imagery, but also Holocaust museum visual displays. Most directly, the House of Terror uses the model of the Tower of Faces, portraits of Holocaust victims projected onto the entire length of walls in the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C., to project portraits of Hungarian victims of communism. While the Hall of Tears in the basement of the Budapest Museum is the visual repurposing of the Children's Memorial at Yad Vashem in Jerusalem. Under the government of Viktor Orban, Hungary has further embarked on a spectacular urban revisioning of the 20th century history. The memorial to the victims of the German occupation, erected in Budapest in 2014, memorializes Hungary, the country, as the main victim of the German occupation, by a not very subtle depiction of Germany's imperial ego crushing of Hungary, which is symbolized by Archangel Gabriel. The memorial was unveiled overnight and with no accompanying official opening ceremony in order to avoid any public debate and expected protests. And indeed, immediately upon unveiling, Holocaust survivors or their family members placed hundreds of handwritten notes, pictures, and objects that you can see at the bottom of the picture outside the memorial that told the story of 430,000 Jews who were deported from Hungary, mostly to Auschwitz, the quickest rate of deportation in the history of the Holocaust, taking less than 2 months and done with the active participation of Hungarian civil servants. In a manner similar to many new public monuments, museums, and memorials across post-communist Europe, the Budapest Memorial uses architecture as a tool to express myths of nationhood as part of a state strategy of new visual remembrance of the past. Specifically, it narratively replaces the memory of the Holocaust and the catastrophe of Hungarian Jewish annihilation as the central memory of World War II in Hungary, with the memory of Hungarian victimhood and innocence. It also purposefully replaces the responsibility for the murder of Hungarian Jews from Hungary's Axis allied government and places it firmly with Germany, presenting fascism and its exterminationist policies as alien, foreign intrusions into the Hungarian body politic. This shift, therefore, completely removes the history of the Holocaust in Hungary before the German occupation in 1944, the period that left some 60,000 Hungarian Jews killed as early as 1942, the extermination carried out not by Germans, but by Hungarian forces under the rule of Regent Miklos Horthy. This new type of Holocaust remembrance that I document in the book is not exactly denial. Viktor Orban even declared 2014 a year of Holocaust commemoration. However problematic, it does not prominently feature voices that deny the Holocaust as a historical fact, nor challenge its most established realities. It is also not quite the same as trivialization. While the emphasis always is on the larger ethnic suffering, it is relatively rare to hear outright belittling of Jewish victimization. A more nuanced way of understanding this type of Holocaust remembrance is as memory appropriation, where the memory of the Holocaust is used to memorialize a different kind of suffering, such as suffering under communism or suffering from ethnic violence perpetrated by other groups. And as my book demonstrates, this process is not simply a byproduct of post-communist transitions. It is in fact an integral part of the political strategy of post-communist states, which are basing their contemporary legitimacy on a complete rejection of communism and a renewed connection to the pre-communist, mythically, nationally pure, and above all, ethnic character of states. It is this rejection of communist doctrinaire supranationalism and its replacement with old-fashioned ethnic nationalism that colors how the Holocaust is remembered. In a global environment of anti-communism, this nationalized Holocaust remembrance has also completely erased the memory of communist anti-fascist resistance as its constitutive part. And this exclusion provides contemporary anti-communist regimes their legitimacy shields. Holocaust remembrance, then, is no longer about the Holocaust at all, but is about very acute legitimacy needs of post-communist states, which are building their identity as fundamentally anti-communist, which then in turn helps them be perceived as more legitimately European. To understand this process, I argue that post-communist states today are dealing with conflicting sources of insecurity. They're anxious to be perceived as fully European by quote-unquote core Western European states. But that status remains fleeting, especially in the aftermath of the openly anti-East European rhetoric of the Euro crisis and Brexit. Being fully European, however, means sharing in the cosmopolitan European narratives of the 20th century, perhaps the strongest being the narrative of the Holocaust. The European narrative of the Holocaust, which understands it as the foundational block of post-war European identity, has created stress and resentment in post-communist states, which have been asked to accept and contribute to this primarily Western European account as members or candidate states of the European Union. The problem is that the cosmopolitan Holocaust memory as developed in the West does not narratively fit with a very different set of Holocaust memories in post-communist Europe. This lack of fit is evident primarily in the lack of centrality of the Shoah as the defining memory of the 20th century experience across the post-communist space. Instead of the memory of the Holocaust, Eastern European states after communism constructed their national identities on the memory of Stalinism and Soviet occupation, as well as pre-communist ethnic conflict with other states. The European centrality of the Holocaust then replaces the centrality of communist and ethnic victimization as the dominant organizing narrative of post-communist states, and is therefore threatening and destabilizing to these state identities. In the book, I document how influencing European Union's own memory politics and legislation in the process, post-communist states have attempted to resolve these insecurities by putting forward a new kind of Holocaust remembrance, where the memory, symbols, and imagery of the Holocaust become appropriated to represent crimes of communism instead. The criminal past is not fully denied, but the responsibility for it is misdirected. And this accomplishes two things. It absolves the nation from acknowledging responsibility for its criminal past, while at the same time, it makes communism as a political project criminal. By delegitimizing communism, post-communist states have also removed anti-fascist resistance from the core memory of the Holocaust, which has allowed for a revival and ideological normalization of fascist ideological movements in the present. The centrality of the Holocaust as a foundational European narrative, however, is also soundly rejected across much of post-communist Europe because of its perceived elevation of Jewish victimhood above victimhood of other regional majority ethnic groups, a move that is increasingly openly resented. Further, the European Holocaust memory's focus on Jewish suffering is also begrudged in much of the region because it brings about discussion about extensive and deep local complicity in the Holocaust and material and political benefits of the complete Jewish absence across Eastern Europe. Jewish businesses, homes, and property have over decades of looting, followed by communist seizures, slowly morphed into the general economy with difficult and sporadic attempts at restitution. Contemporary Holocaust remembrance practices, such as those sanctioned by the Polish or Hungarian governments, avoid these difficult discussions by deflecting all responsibility for the genocide of the Jews onto Nazi Germany, absolving the national past from any appearance of impropriety or crime. So my book aims to put these episodes of memory inversion in a contemporary political context by arguing that they're not isolated instances of competing memory, but instead critical elements of national strategies of political legitimacy. They serve to reposition national narratives in opposition both to those of communism, but also those historically embraced by Western Europe, and instead reclaim a national identity that rejects multiculturalism and is rebuilt along ethnic majoritarian lines. It is quite clear that cultural issues of identity and history have been integral to the rise and consolidation of populism in post-communist East Europe, as the question of who are the real victims of history has been central to the populist enterprise. The fact that East European victimization under communism is not adequately understood and appreciated in the West is the central grievance of these movements, and it feeds into a new cycle of victimization. This time, the perceived oppression by Western liberal ideals, such as gender ideology, feminism, LGBTQ rights, or even more dramatically, Middle Eastern migration and refugee flows. The core of populist resentment is the issue of cultural imposition. And the deepest cultural imposition is the imposition of memory of their own pasts. And with that, I look forward to the comments of the discussant and the questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much to Dr. Subotic. I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing that. I should know better. Thank you very much for Dr. Subotic for that wonderful talk, and to Alejandro, to Dr. Bayer for inviting me to comment on this wonderful talk and have the opportunity to familiarize myself with her book Yellow Star, Red Star. I have to say that this has been a wonderful opportunity. I'm really looking forward to using the book in some of my courses, and it's very encouraging. In fact, the last line of the book is one that I often repeat when teaching Eastern European Holocaust history, specifically, and I'll be quoting her here: "The Holocaust is not just in the Eastern European past; it continues to be a part of its present." This is I 100% agree with this, and I find this commentary very, very helpful. Throughout, by thinking about this book and Dr. Subotic's comments today also brought me back to a text that I read in grad school, specifically Ronald Schechter's Obstinate Hebrews, which focuses on representations of Jews in revolutionary France. I realize this is a somewhat seemingly tangential reference, but I promise that I'll get there. Schechter argues in this book that Jews were, and here I'm using his terminology, good to think with. In other words, that discussions about the rights, citizenship, and position of Jews in revolutionary French society were not really about Jews at all, given that Jews were a relatively small minority in France, but were essentially a way to debate notions of citizenship, modernity, and national identity, and to try to unravel these questions. It occurred to me that Subotic's work demonstrates that Jews, and in this case, I would emphasize particularly dead Jews, are good to, and I would say to remember, or better yet, misremember with. In that Holocaust commemoration seems to be a tool for debating issues related to national identity and crafting what has been referred to as a usable past for post-communist Eastern European regimes looking to position themselves within the EU and within the larger global community. So again, I think this has to do more with Jews, specifically Jewish victims, dead Jews, as a vehicle for making sense or trying to craft certain narratives for these Eastern European states. It is also telling that these spaces, the exhibits, the memorials, the books, the events, seem relatively uninterested in the voices and stories of actual Jewish survivors, and in many cases quite resistant to them, especially when they bring up messy histories related to topics of collaboration and complicity. Getting into the messy details of individual accounts doesn't serve the purpose these spaces are oriented towards. Though Dr. Sobotec's book was published in 2019, it's clear that her findings are both relevant and very helpful for understanding recent developments. In Poland, the recent defamation case brought against Holocaust historians Jan Grabowski and Barbara Engelking demonstrates the continued politicization and instrumentalization of Holocaust memory and the official pushback against an actual engagement with the messy history of the Holocaust as presented in Grabowski's and Engelking's work. Another example of this these continued tensions is the months and maybe years-long controversy over the renomination of the director of the Polin Museum in Warsaw, and his eventual resignation under the pressure of the government, of the official party. Perhaps even more urgent, given recent events, is the instrumentalization of Holocaust history in the Russian-Ukrainian conflict. And I think these comments are particularly relevant today as we sit on what seems to be the brink of an actual violent conflict between Russia and Ukraine. As discussed briefly in Sobotec's book, not mentioned in the talk today, Russia has repeatedly accused Ukrainian nationalists of being fascists, based very loosely on, on the real association of some Ukrainian nationalist units with the Nazis and their participation in killings of Jews. But this has given Russia, or Russia has appropriated this story, I'll use the terminology, has appropriated the story to portray Ukrainian nationalism writ large as quote unquote fascist. And Russia has portrayed its own campaign as a continuation of a historical anti-fascist agenda, continuing to be the victor, the force that will liberate Europe from fascism. Last September, or this past September, I should say, marked the 80th anniversary of the massacre at Babi Yar, one of the main massacre sites in the Soviet Union, one of the main massacre sites in Europe, period. A site outside of Kiev where over 30,000 Jews were massacred, including members of my own family, I should add, or my grandmother's family, but has been over the past, 80 years now, right? A site of continual debate and tension and frustration over the planning and construction of memorials. The current memorial, the current memorial complex has been in the plans for some years. Some elements of it, including a sort of pop-up synagogue and a multimedia experience, or a multimedia remembrance performance, were unveiled this year, but the construction of these memorials have set off continued debate. Tensions erupted when it became known that a significant amount of funding for these projects came from Russian oligarchs connected with Putin. Thus, the memorial seems to have become a victim, and yet another victim, in the Russian-Ukrainian conflict. In fact, I would argue that this is yet another case where several constituencies, Ukrainian and Russian, are interested in appropriating this memorial space to craft their own historical narratives to go along with their version of the usable past. And again, all too often, victims' voices, survivors' voices get sidelined in this political debate. Lastly, I just want to say a few words about Russia, which kind of looms large in this discussion. Russia itself occupies an interesting place in these memory wars. Sobotec has argued very convincingly that Holocaust memory has been appropriated in post-communist Eastern European states to serve within an anti-communist to serve within an anti-communist narrative, associating fascism with communism as the enemy. This narrative does not fit in Russian political and historical discourse, because Russia serves as the inheritor of the Soviet legacy, and it's very difficult for Russia to deny its own association with the communist past. I would argue that the political regime, certainly Putin's regime, it does not really intend to do so. Thus, in Russia, Holocaust memory has been subsumed within a general narrative of the Second World War, the Great Patriotic War, which sees Jewish sacrifice and heroism as part and parcel of a larger Russian story of martyrdom, sacrifice, and eventual victory over fascism. The official narrative of the Great Patriotic War is not undoubtedly one of the key legitimizing vehicles of the current Russian state, as evidenced by the vibrant celebrations and demonstrations and parades on Victory Day, including Putin and Putin's forays into historical writing, where he writes articles about the history of the Great Patriotic War. Interestingly, the crafting and the propagation of this historical narrative has meant not so much perhaps appropriation of the Holocaust, but silencing of Holocaust memory. Interestingly, Russia has not capitalized on another part of this history, one that my research actually focuses on: the fact that over 1 million Jews survived the Holocaust in the Soviet interior, the largest contingent of survivors, which constitutes the largest contingent of survivors in Europe. However, popularizing the stories of these Holocaust survivors would necessitate on the Russia's part a broader discussion of the elements of the Soviet past that the Russian state would rather keep hidden, specifically the story of the initial defeats Russia suffered at the Soviet Union suffered at the hands of the Nazis, the messy evacuations, and the story of deportation and mistreatment of evacuees and refugees that is part and parcel of the story of survival. So in other words, the Russian state has not used this narrative, I would argue, because it brings up messy histories, and those some of those survivors are still with us, so they can also articulate some of those stories and have begun to do so. In conclusion, I would just like to thank Dr. Subotic for her work. I think this is a wonderful contribution to a larger discussion of Holocaust memory and memory appropriation. Given recent events, I would argue that this is a discussion that needs to continue, and we need to become ever more aware of it, because it continues to be a part of the political landscape in Eastern Europe. Thank you very much. I will turn to our we will now open it up for Q&A. I believe we wanted to have the Q&A in, we wanted folks to, audience members to leave the Q&A in the Q&A box, but I see some questions here in the chat. So I can, here, a question from Bergant Kagler. I would love if Professor Subotic explore more how she conceives legitimately crises of Eastern European countries through replacing Jewish victims with crimes of communism. How do such visual discursive strategies enable these countries to claim international security? I don't know if I know that you've addressed part of that question.
Yeah. No, I can expand a little bit. No, that's kind of at the core of the book's argument. So certainly I can say a few words about it. So the core argument that I make is that the end of communism represented a crisis situation for most East European countries. The worldview shattered, the practices of daily life shattered. There was something new now on the horizon, and these countries and these societies needed to reformulate their identities. What they were told their biography and their history was supposed to change. And one of the big desires of post-communist societies was to join Europe, and in many countries they would say to rejoin Europe, as they perceived that they were artificially cut off from Europe's history since 1945. And so there was this very strong desire to rejoin the European cultural space. But also part of the legitimacy of post-communist governments was based on a complete break with communism. What makes us, the new government, legitimate in the eyes of the public is that we are completely different from what came before. And that happens, periodically through history, not just post-communist to communist, but also obviously communists to what happened before. So these regimes built their political legitimacy on promising that they are completely different. They will cut off all relations with communism and with communist narratives. At the same time, they were pressured in many ways by international organizations, primarily by European Union, various European Union organizations, such as Council of Europe, for example, to explore their own political history and present it in a way that is more in line with what has already developed as what we now call the cosmopolitan memory of the Holocaust, as developed in the West. That and the foundational aspects of that cosmopolitan memory is that the Holocaust is, one of the foundational stories of the 20th century. It's one of the foundational stories of the European Union. The focus is on overwhelming Jewish suffering and the need for restitution, and also the need for exploration of complicity and collaboration. That Western narrative that projected the Holocaust as the most important political event in the 20th century did not sit well, as both my presentation and Natalia, your presentation mentioned, did not sit well with a narrative as developed in these societies. All of a sudden, Europeans are coming and telling us that we have to remember the Jews. What about us? My grandmother was deported by the Soviets. My mother was victimized by the communists. My father was denied, and he was put in prison by the communists. Why do I have to talk about the Jews? Where are the Jews? Why do we always have to talk about the Jews? Jews have their memorials. They have their museums. They have, and there you get quickly into the anti-Semitic arguments. They have their international lobbies and power. What about us? We need to use this moment where the focus is on, collective shared memory to tell the West that it's not just about the Holocaust and it's not just about the Jews, it's also about us and our suffering and our pain and our victimization by communists. And so it served, this appropriation served two goals. Number one is to further support legitimacy of the new post-communist states by saying we're completely different, we are making a clean break with communism, everything that communism did was horrible, we're going to be completely different, number one. And number two, to send a message to the West, yes, maybe we can participate in the cosmopolitan memory of the Holocaust, but we can do this only on our terms. And our term is for you to equally care about our victimization under communism as everybody seems to care about Jewish suffering. And so I think that confluence of mutually conflicting pressures led to the moment in which these cultural politics and social politics of post-communist countries have moved in the direction of visual and narrative appropriation of the Holocaust to tell a different story, a story that they found more acute and more important for their political needs.
Natalie,
Very much. Thank you very much. I don't know if I'm experiencing a little bit of technical difficulties or freezing. I don't know if it's only on my end.
We can hear you well.
Yes, I'm sorry. Are you able to hear me? Okay, thank you. Yeah, thank you very much. another question that came up here was, I'll be directing the diary of, from an anonymous attendee. I'll be directing the diary of Anne Frank. Any misappropriation associated with that script, and any online sources you can recommend relative to the play. I'm aware of the various worldwide museum websites. I don't know if that's kind of outside
I can
of your
say a few things. I'm not
geographical
quite.
space,
I
but-
can't. Yeah, I'm not really. I'm not aware of many online sites that could help with the play. I'm trying to think. If I think of some, I will mention. But I will say a few things about the Anne Frank diary more broadly. Yes, I would say that there has been appropriation in many different ways of the Anne Frank diary, and in some ways, Anne Frank diary is long stopped being about Anne Frank. So I think that's the first issue. There has been an interesting debate to the extent to which Anne Frank has been used as a symbol, firstly, of all of Holocaust. And I mean, you know, when at least in the United States, when children first in schools learn about the Holocaust, they're all learning through Anne Frank. And so to what extent is that, you know, an appropriate and representative story about the Holocaust? Maybe, but maybe not. It's certainly incomplete. But also it has come to represent increasingly the story of kind of oppression and human rights abuses beyond the Holocaust, so that, you know, the Anne Frank story and the Holocaust story has become something much larger, to the extent that even her Jewishness is no longer important, or the fact that she was killed because she was Jewish often gets dropped. I will just tell you, for example, in the, you know, when we used to fly, and we used to fly internationally, and we used to have those in-flight magazines, they no longer exist. And I used to collect all of those. I have a whole separate project that, anyway, that's an interest of mine on the side, because I was interested in how countries represent themselves through in-flight magazines. And KLM, the Dutch airline, in one of their issues, advertising Amsterdam as a destination, mentioned the Anne Frank house. And in the entire story, there was about, you know, half a page in that magazine. In the entire story, not once was Anne Frank mentioned as being Jewish or killed in the Holocaust. The entire story is almost, it's truly bizarre. It's almost like an uplifting story about, you know, one girl's perseverance and coming of age and sharing her intimate moments and hiding during the war, and she was helped, and it's kind of the triumph of the human spirit. And you never really get to the story of why she was there in the first place and really what happened to her. And there were some complaints. Somebody issued a complaint to KLM and just asked that this be contextualized in a more appropriate way. And I mean, this was not the verbatim response, but basically the crux of the response was talking about a Holocaust is a downer. It's not something that we want to really advertise in an online magazine. It was too depressing. And so they came up with this kind of convoluted story about Anne Frank being a kind of a message of hope. And so I think that, you know, there's the other problems with the way in which this will become commercialized and kind of trivialized as well. So I think there's more to explore about what the story of Anne Frank and how it's represented in education and in popular culture, what that has maybe done to decontextualize really the story of the Holocaust.
Thank you very much. Another question that came in here from Catherine O'Donnell. Do you think that the blame of all Holocaust crimes on German people is especially detrimental to German relations with the rest of Europe?
I don't think so, only because I'll say a couple of things on this. Germany has certainly done more to discuss its own responsibility and responsibility of its citizens and society and military and paramilitary troops than really any other country. And so if anything, Germany is often used as a model for how other countries should deal with, accountability, responsibility, and what we call dealing with the past. If anything, I would say that Germany has actually benefited in its foreign relations from this sense that it is a model of how to talk about your past. So in other words, Germany gets a lot of kind of positive points in its relations with others because of its relatively unique strategy of remembrance. And obviously, in terms of public remembrance and remembrance in cities and through memorials and monuments, Germany is way ahead of any European country. There's not even a comparison. Also, Germany has paid reparations. Germany has done restitution. I have a new project that I'm starting that's looking at looted Holocaust art, and it's how it became part of national heritage of other countries that have taken it. And as part of that, I'm looking at how different European countries have dealt with that. And again, Germany is at the top in terms of having not complete, because this cannot be complete, but as complete as possible, registry of art that was taken from Holocaust victims, and asking the public to submit claims if they think that this was taken from their families. And it's a very transparent, I think it's an online database that anybody can go in. That's, again, way ahead of other countries that I'm looking at, where everything is under cloud. You can never find it. Everybody knows. There's no documents. It's always hidden. So I think that Germany has certainly is used then as an example. I think that maybe in some ways Germany is not as perfect as it makes it sound to be, and there are a lot of resistance and a lot of backlash to this, and that leads to some other problems. But certainly in comparison to other European countries, Germany's ahead. What I talk about in my work is how other countries in Europe that were locations of the Holocaust, where there was collaboration, cooperation, complicity, or even direct perpetration, have all very conveniently said that it was all Germany. They had nothing to do with anything. Germany came, Germany gave arms to local people, Germany made orders, and nothing that anybody could do, which we know historically is just not true. I mean, in countries like Croatia or Slovakia, they had their own not completely, I shouldn't say, but largely independent states and regimes that were carrying out their own Holocaust of their Jews with very little input or control from Germany. So I think blaming Germany is incredibly convenient for a lot of the countries to say, yes, Holocaust was horrible. We feel horrible about this. It was all Germany. It's not us.
Thank you very much. We have a excellent question from Professor Emerita Dr. Gary Cohen. He writes, to the extent that communist narratives of the impact of Nazi occupation in East Central Europe downplayed or submerged the victimization of Jews into national narratives of the suffering of the whole population of the occupied countries, do you see at least some continuity between East Central European communist discourse on the Holocaust and the post-communist narratives? The communist governments in the region were certainly capable of playing nationalist cards in their own way, after all.
Yes, absolutely. I think, I mean, in the case of Russia, as you have indicated, the narratives are almost unchanged. But also in many other countries, even while they're trying to argue that there's a huge break with communism and, we're not going to be like the communists were and we're going to start from scratch, in terms of memory of the Holocaust and explaining collaboration, complicity, not much has changed. Again, there's a very strong sense, just like under communism, that Holocaust victims were one among many, and often the terms are used, victims of the war who just happen to be Jews, but there were also victims of the war who happen to be, Lithuanian or Polish or Serbian. That narrative that the Holocaust is not a unique event, but it's just something that happened during the war that was at the cornerstone of communist remembrance that continues to exist. And there is, to the extent that Holocaust is even considered as a unique event, as I was just talking about, it's externalized to Germany. And the memory of the war is still one where the ethnic majority population is primarily victimized. And that absolutely remains. And I think you're absolutely right. I think that these continuities exist. I mean, communism was there for a very, very long time. And the practices of remembrance, the practices of memorialization, the way in which history books were written, all of that continues in many ways. And some of these new developments that are coming, they're impacted by external pressure, maybe changes on the margins, considering the enduring legacy of communist remembrance.
Yeah, thank you very much. And I did actually want to take my moderator prerogative to ask a question of my own. I think you commented a bit on Russia and its role in all of this, and I wonder how would you would characterize Russia's appropriation or lack thereof of Holocaust memory. I also wanted to ask about the term that you're using in terms of appropriation. I've often heard reference to this kind of competitive victimhood, right? Who suffered more, the numbers game, how many Jews, how many non-Jews died. But appropriation, you're suggesting kind of a replacement of using Holocaust imagery, but replacing it with other victim groups and other, enemy groups. But I wonder if we're also seeing sort of where the narrative of yes, the Jews suffered, but so did we, or well, we all suffered, and why are Jews being singled out? Those kinds of narratives are subsumed in that, or do you think that's a separate phenomenon?
So first on the story of Russia, as you said in your remarks, Russia looms large, and Soviet Union looms large, and some of the diversity in Holocaust remembrance practices in the region really have to do with the relationship of those countries to the Soviet Union and to Russia. So when I, in my book, study the Balkans and then compare it to the Baltics, there is a big difference. I mean, the Balkans, the former Yugoslavia, had a different relationship with the Soviet Union, was not occupied by the Soviet Union, doesn't really have a relationship with Russia that it fears. And so it has a different, the logic behind Holocaust revisionism in those countries is more internal. It's not a fear of Russia. It's more in Croatia, really dealing with the fact that Croatia had a standalone, fully fascist Holocaust project that has become much more normalized and rehabilitated in recent history. And in Serbia, there's an extremely strong narrative of Serbian victimization that goes beyond just the Holocaust, but really for like hundreds of years. And there's a very, very strong and quite unique narrative of Serbs being the same as the Jews. Often politicians would talk about, we are the ones who are hated and we're the ones who are always blamed for everything. We're just like the Jews, and the Croats killed us, Serbs just like the Jews. And there's this very strong affinity with Israel, but because we are the country that had no anti-Semitism and we helped our Jews. And it's a very kind of I call it narcissistic identification with Jewish suffering. And then you go to the Baltics, where it's all about Russia. It's all about the Soviet Union, but it's all about today's Russia. So they're incredibly sensitive to any argument about their own kind of fascist legacy or rehabilitation of a lot of, Nazi collaborators or supporters. And this goes in Ukraine, obviously, with the UPA, UPN, ONA, all of that. And then obviously across the Baltic states. And it's very hard to have a discussion about this because you're accused as talking like Putin. And so it's not just me, me too, but also many other scholars who would even broach the topic of collaboration with the Nazis, the response would be, well, that's just what Putin says. Well, maybe that's not always wrong. I mean, there's elements of this. There was collaboration. There was anti-Semitism. I mean, most Jews in Lithuania were shot by Lithuanians. And I mean, that's just the fact. And, you know, there were pogroms in Lithuania in June and July of 1941 before the Germans even came. So, I mean, I talk about all that in the book in great detail, and I build on research of others. So this is not, you know, I'm not coming up with any new historical finding here. This is all established. So there's this difficulty in talking about the Holocaust and the role of the local population and the Nazi sympathies, that how to disassociate that from today's Russia and from what these countries perceive is their constant threat from Russia. And so I think that to a large extent explains continuing revisionism, continuing reluctance to really explore the deep embeddedness of collaboration and cooperation in a lot of these countries, because it's so meshed with today's kind of geopolitical concerns when it comes to Russia, especially.
Thank you very much. And actually, you mentioned the Yugoslav situation, so I think we should jump to that question. From Nicoleta Stremak, you spoke about the end of communism presenting a crisis leading to the Holocaust appropriation. What about the 1990s Yugoslav? Have those changed or affected these processes at all in the former Yugoslavia?
Right. No, absolutely they have. I mean, I don't think you can understand either the war of the 1990s without understanding the narrative of World War II in these countries, or I don't think you can understand the contemporary interpretation of World War II and the Holocaust without looking through the prism of how the war of the 1990s changed that narrative. So, I mean, very simply, the war of the 1990s was in many ways waged as a continuation of World War II in the mind and the narrative of political leaders. Serbs would say, we need to fight against the Croats, because last time they committed genocide against us, so we need to defend against them. And that was, I mean, basically Slobodan Milošević's argument when he made this big speech in Kosovo that started the Serbian nationalist mobilization at the end of 1980s. He made that very explicit argument. He said, I am going to be the one who will no longer let Serbs be killed, and meant Serbs being killed by Nazis, but also Serbs being killed by Croats. And then from the Croatian perspective, it's you know, we have always had the Serbian problem. We've always had large Serbian minority in our country. They have always caused us problems. We want to be a country of Croats, and one of the sparks for the war between Serbia and Croatia in 1991 was the change in the Croatian constitution under then President Franjo Tuđman, and the constitution changed to say that basically Croatia is the land of Croats. And at that point, the population of Serbian minority was about 25%. So you had 25% of the people suddenly written out of the constitution. So all of that brings back the memories of how Serbs were treated in the independent state of Croatia, the genocide committed against them, the crimes against humanity committed against them. Upward of 250,000 Serbs were killed by the Ustaša regime in independent state of Croatia. That means that almost every Serb in Croatia has a memory of murder by the Ustaša regime, or deportation, or put in a concentration camp. So those memories are not going to change in one generation. And so all of that has then come to inform how people understood the threat in the 1990s. And then from today's perspective, there's also a need to portray yourself as a victim so that you cannot be seen as a perpetrator. So again, in the Serbian national narrative, you can hear all the time, like yesterday, I mean, all the time, we cannot be perpetrators. We could have not committed all these war crimes in the 1990s war that you accuse us of, because we are a victim nation. We are the ones who have been victimized in World War II. How could we have, as victims, be guilty of atrocities? And this is just such a deeply embedded narrative in popular culture, in the way people talk in families. It's just taken for it's taken as a social fact. We are victims. So everything that they say that we did in Bosnia, in Srebrenica, in all the massacres, that cannot be, because we were always on the victim side. I mean, it's a really difficult and at this point an intractable social narrative.
Thank you very much. Yeah, that's really, really fascinating. And I will again take my moderator prerogative and do a really quick plug for any students on this talk, and on this call. If you're interested in these topics and interested in Holocaust memory, Holocaust history, and Holocaust memory, I just encourage you to consider the study abroad program to Poland, Jews and Poles and Tangled Lives through the Duluth campus, because we explore a lot of these topics specifically in the Polish context. So we have one more question that deals with kind of directly Holocaust and anti-Semitism, and a couple of questions about the U.S. contemporary context. So let's leave those for the end. I think that would be a good way to wrap up our conversation today. So one more question was, how does this narrative of imposed of Holocaust horrors interact with a known history in many of these states of pogroms that predate the Nazi invasion? The Holocaust cannot be compared to a pogrom, but there are similarly foundational aspects of anti-Semitism in both.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. I would say that the history of pre-Holocaust pogroms is not a very well taught history, and not something that non-Jewish families have a habit of talking about. I think that there's a big difference in how Jewish families and non-Jewish families remember the history and what they know and what they've been told. Again, some of it comes from this focus on your own victimization and your own memory. Some of it comes for lack of interest, indifference. Some of it comes from, almost as I was saying in the talk, almost complete Jewish absence in a lot of these places. Some of it comes from the way in which for us as Holocaust scholars may be jarring, but for the general public is an indifference when it comes to dealing with these issues. For us who study this for a living, this is the most important topic. For the general public, it's just not. So as part of this research and something else I've been writing before the book, I looked at some of the textbooks. And the textbooks I looked in Serbia, for example, Holocaust is discussed. I think they've changed since then, so the books now are better. But the books that I looked at about 10 years ago would have a paragraph about the Holocaust. And there was one that I cited in some other articles I wrote that said something like, the Holocaust is the murder of Jews by Germany. It's something that was done in Central Europe, not in the Balkans, and they move on. And that was what 8th grade history textbook said about the Holocaust. So it's just something that people kind of hear about, know about, don't really care about, maybe have seen in the movies, but it's just not something that's an integral part of their understanding of the 20th century, let alone of their own countries. So I would not be surprised that there's lack of knowledge about the history of anti-Semitism and the pre-Holocaust pogroms. When I was researching Lithuania, it was extremely difficult to find Lithuanian sources that actually did talk about pre-Holocaust pogroms. This, I don't want to get into the weeds of this, but this is one of the most controversial things in Lithuanian historiography to this day, is whether that first week, there was kind of a political void when the Soviets retreated and before the Germans came. It was the first week, June, July, 1941. What happened? There was a series of pogroms, thousands of Jews were killed. And to this day, that's not something that official Lithuanian historiography acknowledges were pogroms by Lithuanians before the Germans came. Then Germans came, and then there was a full-blown Holocaust. So I would not be surprised that there's very little. I mean, my grandmother was Russian, and I mean, we all have strange relatives, but I remember the, kind of the lack of understanding and interest in the Holocaust that she would display. She would say things like, oh, yes, there was a shtetl there, some Jews live there, but our parents told us not to go and play with them because they can take you. Kind of the same, kind of prejudice that people today have against the Roma. Don't go play with the Roma. They're going to take, what are they going to take you? They're going to take you somewhere. But it was not, it was completely not on her radar to talk about pogroms in Russia, even though she was born in 1913, maybe. She has died since, but certainly throughout her lifetime, she, would have observed and understand. But it was not something that families in non-Jewish households told their kids as something that was important. And that speaks to irrelevance, but it also, I think, speaks to an anti-Semitism and just the otherness, that this was Jewish history. So they can learn about that stuff. They can talk about, that's nothing to do with me.
Yeah, thank you very much. It's fascinating. You mentioned Lithuania. Having studied the Holocaust in Lithuania a bit and visited Vilnius a few years back, I was fascinated with the way in which the museum there talks about the genocide and talks and specific relating to the quote unquote genocide of Lithuanians, not the genocide of Jews, which was obviously took place and in many ways was with the direct participation of Lithuanians. So it was disturbing to say the least. But this is a question from Vinnie Vincent, a student who writes that, I know that this is sort of outside of the scope of this discussion, but do you think that parallels can be drawn between appropriation of Holocaust memory and other war appropriation, like that of Civil War imagery in the United States, especially that of the Confederate flag and the notion that the Civil War was primarily a war on slavery?
Yes, I absolutely do think that. I think there's a new book that by Susan Neumann that is about what United States can learn from Germany. And it's about comparing the way in which Germany has tried to deal with symbols of violence, like the swastika, and the way in which the United States doesn't consider the Confederate flag to be something that should be in the same category as a symbol of violence and torture and mass killing. And she goes through different, obviously, histories in the two countries, but way in which United States could begin to learn some lessons about, how we understand our political and social space and political memory and political symbols that could be useful for our understanding. But yes, I absolutely agree. I think that there are many, many parallels. I think, in fact, there's a lot of research that shows that a lot of the Nazi racist ideology came straight from American eugenicist movement and American anti-African American eugenicist movements before the 1930s. So the Nazis were well aware of racist experiments and race science as it existed in the United States in the beginning of the 20th century. So there's, if you want to think about it more broadly, United States racist ideology is also in some ways generative of what was then taken over by the Nazis as well. So I think that's also very important for us when we understand our own history and how the deeply embedded racism in this country has global implications. But in terms of remembrance, I also agree that there's appropriation, there's revisionism, there's flat out lies. I'm sure you all are following all this drama about school boards and what what children are supposed to learn and how, children should not learn that anything bad ever happened. And, the slavery wasn't that bad. They had housing. It's just like unbelievable things that you would not think that, educated people would argue. But again, it doesn't really matter if they believe it or not. They may not really believe that slavery was not that bad, but it's about a profound resistance to admitting responsibility of all of us as citizens, as as people who belong to an ethnic majority, as white people, and how much our white status in this society continues to be privileged, and it's built on the injustice of the past. This is, I'm not making a very grand political statement. I just think it's just obvious that, you know, there are continuing issues of kind of social stratification that our, you know, racial identity provides on the back of other people's suffering. I mean, I just think that's very obvious, but it's so resisted in this country, and it's really, it's very difficult to get through to people to say, you know, I'm not judging you. I'm just saying, you know, we all need to be responsible citizens, and it's, all our societies are better if there's racial and social justice. And this stands for American society. It stands for East European country or any other place. It's much better for all of us to have a broad understanding of our history and a broad understanding of what we are responsible for, and more importantly, what we can do to change to have a more just society moving forward.
Thank you. Yeah, we have another question that sort of, I think you already a bit addressed, that deals with recent controversies in the US surrounding Holocaust education, about ways in which Holocaust education resonates or not in the US, regarding the controversies in Texas, and the Tennessee board that voted to ban the teaching of Spiegelman Maus. I guess I would perhaps revise that, add to that question of whether you see parallels in terms of Holocaust issues surrounding Holocaust education in the US and Europe, or this is just very different context and we can't compare the two.
No, I think it's comparable. I mean, maybe the issues are slightly different, but I think it's I think it comes from this reluctance to deal with the legacies and our own responsibility for it. In the United States, it seems to me that it's kind of the Holocaust on its own has become immersed into this larger cultural war against education and against educators. So I think it's in some ways more primitive. It's not even really about a Holocaust. It's about, I don't want my teacher to tell my child things that I don't agree with. But you send them to school. I mean, I want my child to learn math from a math teacher. God, you know, not for me. So I mean, it's just, again, it all baffles me that this is something that people object to. So of course you should have a history teacher teach, you know. But so I think it's this primitive, I think, culture war against schools, against educators, against elites. I don't want this elite person to tell me what I think. I know better, blah, blah, blah. So I think it's in that sense, it's not really about the Holocaust. It's just about this control that people want to have over their own lives, and they don't want anybody to tell them what to do. And so they don't want, you know, teachers to tell students what to think. So I think that's part of it. I think that there's been certainly a normalization of far right in the United States, just as it is everywhere. And so we all see these stories of occasional teacher coming up with some horrible, like, Nazi interpretation, or, I mean, there was a horrible story I read he was in a DC suburb of a school where the teacher, who turned out to be a Nazi, had children, I think in 4th grade, do a Holocaust reenactment, where he had them as a group project, organize in groups and like take them to gas chambers. It's just like, it's really kind of boggles the mind, but that's where we're at. So, I mean, the teacher was fired and all of that. But I do think that we're in a moment of just complete lack of respect for educational and cultural institutions. And I think that's where it comes from. I'm not quite sure I agree with the focus on Anne Frank. Like my son started to learn about the Holocaust in public schools around that time, and I think it was 4th grade, maybe earlier. And it was he was a little blunt and a little too much and a little not subtle. So I'm not sure that that's ideal either. There's, I think, a better ways to maybe tie it a little bit more to make it age appropriate and understand a little bit more about why that's something that's relevant to them. I think there's a better way to do it, but certainly I think, I think that students should be exposed to it, of course. And I think in Europe, it depends on where. I think there's still this incredible tendency to put the Holocaust within the larger story of the war and to really, really downplay local participation. And I mean, I keep repeating this local participation, because I do think that that's incredibly important. And I just think that that's such an under-acknowledged piece of this whole story. It was not just Germany. Germany could not have done this. It's people, and it's not just like literal participation and shooting. It's economic benefit. It's somebody moved into that apartment and somebody inherited that dental practice and somebody, got some money somewhere and that all morphed into the general economy and that has huge social and political impact that we, I think, don't really take into consideration enough in my view.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think I'm sure you're familiar with this. I think one of the criticisms of the Kiev Memorial or the planned memorial was this idea that there would be some kind of role-playing feature of it. I think that has been removed, but you mentioned the case with the teacher, and that some compared it to something like Holocaust Disneyland. So that maybe is not maybe is a theme that crops up elsewhere. To conclude our wonderful conversation and to thanking Dr. Subotic, I did want to again take my prerogative and ask you where you see in Eastern Europe specifically this trend headed. If this, how lasting do you think this appropriation is? Do you think there's do you think it's going to wane as this history becomes more and more distant, or from my perspective, all we see so far is an intensification of this narrative? And as I was reading your book, I was struck by how much has taken place since its publication that has reinforced the arguments that you're making. So I guess I wanted to ask you for your sort of forecast on where things are headed in terms of Holocaust commemoration and Holocaust memory and appropriation in Eastern Europe.
I think that depends on the composition of governments. A lot of these extremely revisionist practices come from right-wing governments and populist governments. There's a reason why this is all happening in Poland under peace and why it's happening in Hungary under Orban. It's not a coincidence. And so these regimes have a particularly nationalistic legitimacy need and present themselves as kind of, protectors of the nation and all of that. I think if there were a change in governments, I certainly think that if peace would go out of power and a more center-left government would take over in Poland, we would have poor Dariusz Skola back as the director of Polin Museum. I mean, that's just such a politically obvious manipulation and really abuse of scholarly expertise. I certainly in Hungary, this is all Orban's vision. And, people behind the House of Terror, this woman, Maria Schmidt, who is his advisor, who's the main person behind this, they all come from the same political party and political agenda. So I think that if there were a change, if there were a different political regime that doesn't share this nationalist vision, that has a more cosmopolitan as opposed to nationalistic view of both its own history, but also its present, that has a more inclusive view of who is a member of society, a more interest in diversity in society, a more openness. I think that could certainly contribute to a much healthier relation. Because the thing that always baffles me is it would be to such international benefit of a country like Poland to admit what has happened in Jedwabne or in Kielce or in many other, towns where Poles killed Jews. I mean, imagine the international goodwill that could be engendered by an admission, by saying we are the first East European country that's really going to deal with our responsibility for this. And it's in some ways it's really shocking that they cannot perceive that they can even get a political benefit, international political benefit from that. So I think nothing's going to change as long as this particular constellation of power is in place. But that's not going to last forever. I mean, at some point there's going to be a backlash against, maybe on other issues. Maybe in Poland, the backlash of women against all this draconian anti-women legislation, or that can change the dynamic of power, and there could be a political opening to correct for some of this.
One also wonders if the kind of insecurity that you attribute to being some of the sources of this narrative could potentially, wane once perhaps once these countries feel more confident in their role within the EU.
Absolutely, that's 100% right. The more insecure they are, the more they lash out. The more security. The reason Germany is a secure country, it's secure in its own identity, and it has the potential and the capacity to reckon with elements of its past because it comes from a position of security. And I completely agree with you. The more these countries become secure in their European identities, I mean, I think maybe a country that's slight exception to this would be the Czech Republic. I think the Czech Republic is a little bit more holistic, certainly in terms of appreciating the role that Czech Jews played in the establishment of Czech culture and society. It's very different, and it's more, I would say, more nuanced and more inclusive than in some other places. So maybe that's, a possible path forward.
Thank you very much. Thank you for your wonderful talk. Thank you for your responses to these questions. I want to thank the organizers for inviting me to participate. As I said, I make another plug for those of you who are interested in these topics. Of course, you have faculty members to consult and talk to. But if you're interested in traveling to this area and studying the history of the Holocaust and the memory and commemoration on site, walking through these museums, walking through these camps, talking to locals, I'd encourage you to consider the Poland short-term study abroad program through the Duluth campus. And if any students interested, you're encouraged to please feel free to reach out to me. But the application deadline is coming up next week, so that's in part why I'm particularly promoting this program. And thank you to Dr. Subotic. I'd like to turn to Dr. Bayer to conclude today's event.
Well, I just want to add a thank you on behalf of the Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies, and also the Center for Austrian Studies, who's a co-sponsoring unit. And thank you for such insightful, rich, and also a talk that touches on so many issues that are of universal nature beyond the East European case, right? These dynamics of silence, of denial, of in-group victimization and out-group blame. I'm sure many, as I did, many others also were able to connect to other cases that they're familiar with. So thank you, Yelena, Dr. Subotic, and also Dr. Belsky for joining us tonight. And thank you all for attending. And I look forward to future conversations with you in our programming.
Thank you very much. This was a real pleasure for me. Thank you.